Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight we'll trace the entire story of Pearl Harbor. A quiet Sunday morning broke without warning. Explosions tore through the harbor, lives were cut short, and a country that had watched from afar was pulled into a war it could no longer ignore. We will stay close to the people who lived it and to the quiet ways this day still shapes American life. But before we begin, if you find comfort in calm retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, you're welcome to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, settle back, and let the rest of the day drift away while we ease into tonight's story. In the years before Pearl Harbor, the Pacific felt distant to many American families. Europe was at war again, yet daily life at home leaned on routine and repair after the Depression. Sundays meant church, ball games, errands, and long dinners. Hawaii was the territory, a crossroads of sugar fields, shipyards, and neighborhoods that mixed languages. On Oahu, soldiers drilled, sailors painted rails, and children biked past fences toward beaches and shops. The fleet lay at anchor during many weekends because fuel budgets and training cycles favored economy. Radio carried crooners and ball scores, while newsreels showed distant fronts that felt like another planet. People did not expect sudden war to crash into a calm harbor within a single morning. The stage was set by habits that prized thrift, distance, and trust in big oceans. This quiet would meet forces already gathering beyond the horizon. In Washington, leaders watched Asia with caution while budgets recovered and factories found their speed. Japan had spent decades building an industrial state, with a navy seeking reach and recognition abroad. Economic shocks and politics at home pushed leaders to see resources as central to survival itself. By the early 1930s, the Army entered Manchuria and established a compliant regional regime there. War in China widened steadily, and images of bombed cities reached Americans through papers and radio. Some saw a far struggle. Others sensed a rising storm that could cross oceans very soon. Debate at home weighed trade, ideals, and fear of another grinding overseas war for the country. Neutrality laws limited arms sales, while relief drives tried to answer reports of civilian suffering abroad. Naval planners studied charts and considered fuel, distance, and the choke points between island chains carefully. In busy ports, American tankers loaded oil that still flowed to Japan under shifting rules then. Pearl Harbor sat within that uneasy map, a base both familiar and exposed by distance it. At home, the long shadow of the Depression shaped choices about taxes, recruitment, and federal spending. Many voters wanted peace and stability, and looked warily at entanglements across oceans and continents elsewhere. Organizations argued for strict neutrality, while others argued aid should flow to threatened democracies in Europe. Factories began to stir as contracts expanded shipbuilding, aircraft production, and munitions for growing forces again. Conscription returned in limited form, and training camps spread across fields, forests, and coastal towns nationwide. Hawaii watched these shifts while continuing school days, shift work, luau's, and evenings under trade winds. Local papers covered ship movements, athletic scores, union meetings, and small accidents along busy roads daily. The base drew workers and suppliers while hotels hosted tourists, seeking winter sun and surf nearby Pearl Harbor gave steady wages to thousands and shaped neighborhoods built around buses and barracks there. Beneath the normal calendar, risk slowly gathered as leaders far away weighed choices about force abroad. Interwar treaties tried to cage naval competition by limiting tonnage and guns across the main powers. The Washington Treaty placed ceilings and encouraged scrapping, which reshaped shipyards and fleet ambitions alike worldwide. The London Treaty adjusted ratios and pushed ideas about cruisers, carriers, and the future of reconnaissance. American planners trained within those limits and refined gunnery, damage control, and logistics over distance operations. Carriers matured, but the battleship still held pride of place in many minds and budgets then. Exercises imagined meeting an enemy in blue water with lines of heavy guns trading punishment there. Pearl Harbor offered an anchorage and repair hub that fit this vision of a battle line. Fuel tanks ringed the base, and cranes stood ready, while torpedo nets were not yet routine. Radar existed in small numbers with new crews, and patrol patterns wrestled with sheer ocean space doctrine moved forward carefully, tied to budgets, habit, and the belief that warnings would arrive first. On Oahu, people woke early for fields, docks, streetcars, classrooms, kitchens, and busy commissaries each day. Communities mixed native Hawaiian, Japanese, Filipino, Chinese, Portuguese, and mainland families in close neighborhoods and towns. Work followed whistles and ship horns, and paydays moved coins through markets and dance halls near children learned songs in school and watched parades of uniforms pass along streets lined with palms. Churches, temples, and clubs bound neighbors together and softened the edges of long work weeks for many. Civilians and service members shared buses and beaches while shore patrols kept watch near gates. Daily stories about war stayed mostly in print and on screened newsreels before features and cartoons started. Pearl Harbor sat only a few miles from homes where laundry dried under steady island sun. Most people assumed trouble, if it came, would announce itself with days of signals and arguments. The rhythm of errands and drills continued as the year moved toward its final month quietly. Diplomacy between Washington and Tokyo tried to resolve tensions over China, resources, and Pacific security interests. Talks moved through drafts and meetings while armies continued fighting and shipping lanes carried precious fuel. American leaders tightened restrictions on oil and scrap as the year wore on toward winter months. Japan weighed moves south toward Dutch and British colonies and feared strangulation if supplies were blocked. The tripartite pact with Germany and Italy signaled alliance, though plans remained focused on regional aims. American opinion hardened after sinking stories and reports of atrocities, and support for preparedness grew steadily. Military staffs analyzed assumptions while hoping negotiations might succeed before choices closed and consequences multiplied further. Pearl Harbor figured into these calculations because the fleet at anchor affected every estimate of risk. Time seemed available since many believed any conflict would begin slowly with seizures far from Hawaii. Each passing week made people a little more certain that patience might still solve the crisis across the Pacific. Distances swallowed maps and tested logistics that linked mainland ports to far islands. The Philippines guarded approaches to Asia, while Guam and Wake marked lonely stepping stones across emptiness. British forces held bases at Singapore and Hong Kong, while the Dutch ruled rich islands southward. Sea lanes formed lifelines, and war plans drew arcs that hinged on refueling, and air cover. American carriers gained range with new aircraft, while submarines trained to strike shipping during wider war. Battleships still promised presence, a symbol that reassured allies and warned rivals who watched movements closely. Pearl Harbor lay close enough to project power forward, yet far enough to feel sheltered somewhat. Pilots practiced patrol routes and gunnery, while chart makers measured channels and plotted beacon positions accurately. Harbor workers lifted propellers, stacked shells, and painted hulls under cranes and sharp tropical sun. Daily, all of it suggested readiness built for a slow campaign rather than a sudden shattering day. Signals flowed through cables and airwaves, while codes hid plans and filtered understanding through partial glimpses. Intelligence units gathered intercepts and summaries. Yet volume and noise often swamped clarity during pressure periods. Commanders leaned on habits, patrol schedules, and alerts that were uneven across commands and services everywhere. Public awareness remained shallow because secrecy, distance, and concerns about panic kept messages measured and guarded. New radar sets appeared at a few sites and sat alongside training manuals and curious visitors. Pearl Harbor depended on these evolving tools, yet most confidence rested on patrols and human observation. Warnings tended to follow lines of authority that were busy with logistics, ceremonies, and inspections already. The culture of peacetime encouraged courtesy and caution when reporting events that might alarm superiors unnecessarily. Assumptions took root that hostile raids would be spotted far away or deterred by clear signals. Those assumptions framed choices as November turned to December, and calendars filled with ordinary weekend plans. Japanese-American communities on the islands and mainland built businesses, farms, and clubs over generations together in Honolulu. Shopkeepers extended credit, and students joined bands while elders tended gardens behind houses nearby. Many families held dual threads of heritage and citizenship and kept ties to temples and churches. On the West Coast, growers shipped produce while fishermen watched prices and weather and repaired nets. Newspapers sometimes echoed suspicion, yet neighbors often traded favors and shared food across lines of background. Military authorities mapped neighborhoods and kept files, while schools taught civics and languages side by side. Pearl Harbor stood nearby as a daily landmark that felt large, yet apart from family life. Young people chased games and dances, while parents planned savings and sought stability through steady work. Rumors about spies or cells sometimes flickered, though concrete evidence remained thin and contested by authorities. Normalcy held the center because most people expected law and loyalty to hold during any crisis. In Washington, speeches about freedom of the seas and defense production found wider audiences by autumn. Convoys in the Atlantic drew attention while Pacific garrisons stacked sandbags and checked inventories again carefully. Air raid drills appeared here and there, usually brief, usually folded back into ordinary routines after. Civil defense pamphlets mentioned blackouts and first aid while neighborhoods debated costs and inconvenience of preparation. Pearl Harbor remained busy yet peaceful, with leave rosters, maintenance calendars, and weekend liberty still posted. Officers balanced readiness with morale and allowed musicians, ball teams, and chaplains to fill schedules. Often ships displayed flags in neat rows, while aircraft rested under canopies and mechanics shared late coffee. The sense that danger would signal itself stayed strong because past crises had unfolded in stages across the islands. Saturday blended into Sunday with plans for errands, worship, and quiet visits nearby. By sunrise, the world before had finished its run and yielded the stage to new shock. In the weeks before Pearl Harbor, signals moved through cables and sky while routine held. Washington read drafts, summaries, and scraps that hinted at pressure rising across the Pacific. Honolulu scanned the horizon and kept a calendar of drills, concerts, and leave. Commanders balanced fuel, maintenance, and training with the need to show strength without provocation. Newspapers carried reports from China and Europe that felt close at breakfast and far by night. Families on Oahu set alarms, swept porches, and trusted that warnings would arrive before harm. Across desks and decks, choices framed the world that met the coming shock. The machinery of warning ran on people who sorted fragments and tried to weigh them. Some worked nights with headphones and notebooks as traffic poured through the air above islands. Others compared cables from embassies to patterns they knew by habit, error, and experience. Interpretation was hard because signals rarely spoke plainly, and messages arrived late or incomplete. Secrecy and compartmental rules kept many desks from seeing the same map at once. Commanders familiar with drills measured risk in hours and days, not in sudden minutes. Across the water, planners made their schedule and counted on that habit of mind. In late November, Washington sent a sharp notice that war in the Pacific looked near. The words urged readiness without guessing where the first blow would fall or when Army and Navy staffs read the message and turned to fuel, patrols, and watch bills. Harbor gates stayed guarded and airfields kept sentries, while liberty and errands continued. Distance and routine softened edge of alarm because no point was named in notice. Some leaders watched the Philippines and Malaya and thought the first clash would come there. At the harbor, readiness rose a little. Yet the weekend opened with familiar rhythm. Diplomatic messages grew tense as notes crossed oceans and tried to hold positions already fixed. The Japanese embassy in Washington received instructions that arrived in pieces and caused delays. Clerks labored over codes and typed revisions, while couriers waited and hours slipped away. Such details mattered because timing can signal intent in a world where words are weapons. American readers watched the tempo and guessed at plans without seeing a full picture. Across the Pacific, warships and air crews set out on schedules hidden by distance. The gap between signals and ships widened, and within it lay the risk to Hawaii. On Oahu, senior leaders weighed sabotage more than air attack against parked aircraft, and fuel orders placed planes in tight rows to ease guard duty and protect against small teams. Anti-aircraft guns had ammunition nearby, but not always loaded. Under peacetime caution, search patrols were scheduled. Yet gaps opened because of limits on aircraft, crews, and fuel. Generators and communications worked, though phones and radios sometimes failed under strain or habit. Pearl Harbor appeared busy and ready, but it was a posture built for slow warning. The picture looked solid from a distance and fragile at the edges up close. New radar sets stood on ridges and crews tried to match blips to sky. Instruction manuals were short and experience shorter, so confidence rose and fell with practice. The stations were meant to help spot incoming aircraft and guide interceptors onto a path. Shifts were limited because crews were few, and mornings often ended the watch early. On days, the screens showed friendly planes, flocks, and weather echoes that taught patience. Controllers learned the language of distance and bearing while writing notes that captured a picture. All of it felt promising and incomplete, a tool not yet part of habit. Patrol squadrons launched long flights that traced arcs over water and then came home. Crews scanned whitecaps and watched for wakes, smoke, or silhouettes along assigned routes. Engines consumed fuel at steady rates that narrowed how far each mission could reach. Maintenance rules demanded regular checks and meant fewer aircraft were ready than rosters suggested. Weather and darkness limited coverage and left blind stretches that planners hoped to accept for now. Pearl Harbor felt safe inside these rings because distance seemed to guard the approaches. The empty map between outer islands and Oahu looked wide enough to slow any surprise. Across the ocean, planners studied American habits and calibrated plans against those patterns. They trained for problems that had stopped others and shaped tools for shallow water. Pilots rehearsed repeatedly while ground crews kept pace and loaded practice rounds. Radio silence guarded movements and gave security while ships took their stations carefully across open miles. Weather forecasts shaped timing and provided edges that would hide tracks during the long approach. Pearl Harbor lay within range of this plan because surprise could shorten distance and time. The people involved believed their window was brief, and that risk grew with every hour. In the days before impact, rumors rose and fell in bars, shops, and barracks. Some hinted at spies, lights on hills, others faded under laughter and chores. Shore patrols chased small breaches and wrote daily reports that filled drawers across offices. Fishermen, taxi drivers, and guards at gates noticed odd things that felt ordinary. By dark, senior desks needed proof to act, and rarely got it within time to change posture. Pearl Harbor seemed to breathe on its own rhythm and carried families along that tide. The weekend began with that feeling still strong across town and across the base. Saturday passed with errands, work details, and drives along coast as light-softened bands played on bases and in hotels, while cinemas flickered and stores closed their tills. Some wrote letters home and folded them with care, then sealed envelopes and placed stamps. Others cleaned boots, stacked tools, or ironed shirts, and set alarms for early church. Air crews checked rosters and hoped for weather that would make training smooth on Monday. Pearl Harbor lay under a soft night sky while streetcars rattled and radios offered music. People turned off lamps, cracked windows for breeze, and let the air carry sleep. Before sunrise, the first warnings touched the edge of routine and waited for action. A minesweeper reported buoys out of place along a channel that should have been familiar. Phones rang and voices weighed what to do and who to call. At that hour, some reports sounded routine. Others hinted at trouble and asked for follow-up. Outside the entrance, A small drama on the water would soon add to the concern. Pearl Harbor began stir as cooks lit stoves and crews made morning rounds. The day broke in calm light that did not show what moved just beyond sight. Not long after dawn, a radar crew saw a wide return that did not match routine. They phoned the center and reached a duty officer who was new to the post. Training guidance urged calm judgment when unusual patterns appeared, and the call was handled so a flight of heavy bombers was expected, and the return was taken as that. The radar crew watched as the sweep thickened and edged toward the island. Pearl Harbor still looked quiet to the eye, yet one screen now told a different story. The log captured the moment and left the weight of choice on others. Senior command in Hawaii divided responsibility between the fleet and the garrison. One guarded the ships and lanes, the other guarded airfields, posts, and skies. Coordination existed in plans and meetings, yet daily focus rested on separate tasks and measures. Signal paths followed that division of labor and slowed how alerts reached each desk. Exercises had trained people to expect warnings to build, not to arrive and peak within minutes. Pearl Harbor sat inside that structure and would feel the result of strengths and gaps. No single choice decided the morning, but many choices shaped how it would be met. In Washington, the final diplomatic exchange moved toward a Sunday meeting that would close talks. Translators and typists worked through the night while messengers waited for final instructions. The White House and departments watched the clock and tried to read meaning from speed. Around the Capitol, many offices were quiet because it was a weekend. Abroad, ships and air crews followed their plans without sending messages that would break secrecy. Pearl Harbor was not the only point of risk, but it held the nearest fleet. The hour for decision approached in one city, while elsewhere the last minutes of peace held. Sunday morning brought breakfast and the slow cadence of inspections and music. On decks, sailors lined rails, hoisted flags, and swept while cooks ladled coffee into mugs below. Lockers held ammunition, gear, and keys were kept by watchstanders and chiefs. Some guns were manned for practice. Others sat quiet under covers to protect from salt chapels prepared for services, while bands tuned instruments and shore patrols checked the gates. Pearl Harbor looked like a postcard of order and routine set against calm water and hills. The last quiet minutes moved as if they would last all day for everyone across the mainland. Sunday habits set in with papers, church bells, and late breakfasts. Radio networks aired music and news, while editors arranged wires carrying reports from overseas families, planned drives and walks as winter crept toward towns and farms. Factories that had added shifts to defense work were quiet, because it was Sunday in Honolulu. The day opened with errands and worship and with a clean breeze. Pearl Harbor stood still at the center of that map like a hinge between oceans and coasts. Within minutes, the hinge would turn, and people would search for words to understand. Warnings had come as hints, habits, and brief calls, and they were still not enough. People had done their work with care and within limits that shaped their world. Ships sat at anchor and airfields waited for another morning to finish its first hour. Engines far out at sea moved closer, and a line of aircraft neared the island. Inside kitchens and shops, the pace of breakfast and chores kept time as always. The moment before impact belonged to the last calm that any person could recall there. What followed would test courage, leadership, and the bonds that hold neighbors. On the morning of December 7th, the first wave reached Pearl Harbor as sailors brewed coffee and chaplains set out service notes. Across the water, pilots checked formations while carriers held their course beyond the horizon. On decks, flags climbed masts, and music floated from radios as mess lines formed. Boats and whistles cut the air, and hatches opened to sunlight and salt. Nearby gates admitted workers who carried lunches and tool bags for a normal Sunday. A few watchstanders studied screens and sky and saw hints that did not yet convince. Within minutes, engines approached low and fast, and the Mourning stepped across a line. Lookouts pointed and called bearings while buglers reached for instruments and officers scanned the inlet. Men at the ready lockers pulled lids and passed belts of ammunition from hand to hand. Shadows crossed roofs and water as the day changed in a breath. For many on shore, Pearl Harbor still looked calm because sound lags behind sight. Sailors leaned on rails and watched streaks grow until shapes formed and sunlight flashed on wings. Pilots began their runs, and smoke trails marked the first strikes against ships and airfields. The harbor geometry fixed targets that did not move, and that reality favored the attackers. On Battleship Row, men broke from breakfast and reached stations while steam valves groaned and sang. Boats cut free to pull survivors from water as sprays lifted over decks and piers. Shattered glass fell in fans and floors shook as near misses walked along hulls in quick steps. Phones rang and passed urgent words that often crossed or died as wires failed. Junior officers made choices that became anchors for others who needed direction under fire. Fires rose and found fuel and smoke drifted over neighborhoods that faced the channel. Inside the first minutes at Pearl Harbor, corpsmen ran toward noise with stretchers and calm voices. Chaplains moved beside them and kept count so families could be told with care. Drivers pulled trucks and learned to weave through fragments and water sprayed from hydrants. People in nearby streets saw columns rising and tried to judge distance by color, and drift air raid sirens took a moment to begin and then carried a sound across town. Teachers and parents guided children into safer rooms and hallways and kept voices steady. Doctors on duty made triage lines and set priorities by breath and bleeding and movement. Nurses warmed hands and spoke to the injured so fear would not widen an already hard day. Ambulances carried the first groups and returned without pause while volunteers arrived in steady flows. The base hospital filled and overflow sites opened in schools and clubs and spare rooms. Over Pearl Harbor, the first wave split across airfields and ships and worked from practiced routes. Pilots had studied photographs and models and now matched them to landmarks and piers. Torpedoes ran in shallow water because fins had been shaped to keep them from diving. Bombs fell along lines, and the first detonations rolled across hulls and buildings and parked planes. Gunners recovered from the first shock and found arcs through smoke and glare and distance. Some mounts were powered and some were hand-cranked, and both required teamwork under pressure. Damage control parties hauled hoses and shoring and passed messages about flooding and heat. Boats circled to pull people from the water and to ferry the injured to piers. Crews sealed compartments to slow fires and list, while pumps pushed water back toward scuppers. The harbor shook with blasts, and the sky filled with streaks and fragments, and ash witnesses across Pearl Harbor remembered the sound first, and then the rush of heat and wind. Some said the air seemed to bend as shock waves bounced between hills and water. Others spoke of metal that moved like cloth and of smoke that hid the sun. They remembered stamps in letters and the smell of oil paint and burned rope. They remembered the feel of ladders that shook and the weight of a friend on shoulder. They remembered prayers that were a few words and the look of hands that reached. In nearby houses, people closed windows against fumes and laid wet cloths across mouths and eyes. Drivers pulled to the side and watched convoys speed toward the base with sirens steady. Reporters reached phones and wrote lines that would travel across the mainland by afternoon. People listened for names and waited for letters that would arrive later with care. The wave struck airfields to strip the skies and to break response before it rose. Hangars burned and maintenance crews moved aircraft that could roll or be dragged into cover. Pilots reached cockpits and found fragments on runways and had to choose another field. Some aircraft lifted into a sky cut by contrails and smoke and found gaps to fight. Others stayed grounded, and crews shifted to hoses and stretcher work beside neighbors. Field hospitals filled fast, and surgeons worked with supplies laid out on tables and crates. Clerks recorded names and blood types and sought witnesses who could describe where someone had fallen. Residents near the perimeters brought water and bandages and cleared space for vehicles to pass. In churches and halls, people sorted blankets and food and listened for news from loved ones. The first hour closed with new fires growing and with a sense more might come. Back over Pearl Harbor, gunnery teams settled into rhythm and learned to track through smoke. Magazines fed belts as loaders called out counts and kept nerves steady by habit and drill. Directors aligned sights while talkers relayed bearings and told gun captains to hold or fire. Pilots met steadier lines, and a few machines fell into water or onto fields beyond smoke. Hid shapes and forced guesses, and some salvos walked off target and tore rooftops. Neighbors pulled each other clear and moved those who could not move as fire crews arrived. Dispatchers tried to send engines along open streets because fallen lines blocked familiar routes. Water pressure dipped and rose as valves were shut and opened, and as hoses multiplied. Pilots adjusted plans and shifted targets toward the airfields where resistance felt still thinner. The first wave began to turn away with losses that commanders would weigh against goals. On the water at Pearl Harbor, craft lifelines as crews pulled people from oil. They dragged canvas across surfaces and used boat hooks while keeping eyes on debris. They ferried the injured to piers where hands reached with ropes and blankets and faith. Divers went below and felt their way through dark corridors and listened for tapping on steel. On decks, leaders called for calm and spread people out to balance list and fight fire. Damage control schools had taught shoring and foam, and those lessons now traveled by word. Doctors arrived on launches and gave morphine with care and recorded names of kin. Priests and ministers offered prayers that were simple and short and set a steady rhythm. Order grew out of the first shock as people matched needs with teams and tools. The water carried oil and ash toward the channel, and the wind carried sound inland. Signal towers tried to rebuild networks that had failed when lines burned or were cut, and switches failed too. Runners carried notes by hand and used bicycles to cross short distances faster than trucks. Radio crews kept channels open and moved to backup sets when power dipped. Reports moved toward district headquarters and toward Washington as clerks turned fragments into clear lines. Commanders sent orders that focused on air defense and on keeping the channel workable. Pilots who had landed rearmed and refueled and prepared to lift again into a crowded sky. Patrol craft searched the approaches while pickets watched for movement that did not belong. Civic leaders asked residents to stay off roads unless called to work or aid. Hospitals requested blood, and the response filled halls and waiting rooms within an hour. The first wave had passed, but the pattern suggested another would follow across the same ground. Across the island, the news named Pearl Harbor, and the word spread from house to house. People called relatives and gathered neighbors and made choices about what to bring and where to go. Gas stations opened lines of vehicles that carried volunteers and supplies toward posts. Stores distributed flashlights and batteries and closed shutters as managers joined patrols. Schools near the bases took in families who had been driven from homes by smoke and debris. Reporters in Honolulu wrote with restraint and aimed to inform without giving away positions. Radio hosts read official guidance and promised updates when facts cleared and names could be shared. Phones jammed again and again, and people learned to send brief messages that traveled faster. Clergy opened doors and offered quiet rooms for rest and prayer and patient waiting. The island moved together with a steady focus while the military prepared for the next blow. At naval headquarters near Pearl Harbor, staff gathered maps and decided to guard the approaches. Subs and patrol craft were tasked to screen while destroyers sorted crews and made steam. Carriers at sea drew attention because their absence shaped the next choices on both sides. Army Command focused on air defense and on protecting the city from further damage. Civil defense leaders organized wardens and prepared blackouts that would begin after sunset. Hospitals pooled supplies and shared staff across facilities so surgeons could work without delay. Parents picked up children and made plans to stay with relatives who lived farther from the harbor. Visitors who had come for winter sun stayed to help at shelters and kitchens and clinics. Power crews repaired lines and set temporary poles and cleared routes for emergency vehicles. Everyone understood that the first shock would not be the last and worked with that in mind. As the wave withdrew over Pearl Harbor, a hush settled and felt thin and temporary. The harbor still burned and the air still rang, and yet people found their feet. They reset hoses and climbed ladders and opened lockers and searched for missing shipmates. They cleared runways and moved aircraft that could fly to fields where fighters were forming. They loaded guns and checked sights and looked for the line that showed another approach. They carried the injured with care and wrote names and placed tags to guide families later. They listened for orders and for engines and for sirens that would call them again. They prepared for a day that would not end at noon and would reach into night. They understood that the next would involve questions and tasks and a widening war. They stood ready as the horizon grew busy once more, and the sky began to thicken. At Pearl Harbor, Battleship Row waited along Ford Island as Sunday morning routine settled over decks and piers. Steam hung lightly in the air there. Mooring quays held the line of ships, bows forward, flags rising, coffee pouring, with watchstanders scanning water and sky by habit on a Sunday. Across the channel, Ford Island stirred with music. Chaplains prepared services, and tool carts rattled across planks toward maintenance jobs as laughter drifted from barracks. The Arizona lay moored beside her tender, lines taut, crew at breakfast, magazines secured, boats resting quietly alongside. Sun touched paint and brass along rails. Within minutes, the piece shivered. Engines roared low, and shadows gathered above as the first wave slid toward its chosen corridor over the anchored line. Pilots approached low over the water, aligning on masts and piers, while torpedoes, adapted for shallows, steadied in tracks as crews committed to practiced runs. Gunners on the ship swung mounts and shouted bearings, loaders fed belts, and officers cleared the decks as the geometry narrowed brutally in those moments. The Oklahoma listed fast under strikes, capsized beside her berth, and men inside found darkness cut by pockets of air and tapping voices for help. The West Virginia settled on the bottom with fires along decks, while the Maryland absorbed punishment but kept a steadier stance at her moorings there. The Tennessee and the California fought flames and flooding, and the Nevada would soon try to move under her own power toward the channel entrance. On the Arizona, alarm passed through compartments as crew ran to stations, opened ready boxes, and pulled hoses across iron decks already warming under fire boats alongside cast-off to clear space, while sailors hauled ammunition in chocks, and officers scanned the sky for patterns in the dives and turns. A bomb pierced near the forward magazines, and the explosion rose through the ship with a force that broke steel and lifted turrets from sockets. A great cloud climbed in an instant, searing and dark, and the shock carried across the harbor and into streets beyond the gates that morning. Oil burned across the water, and fragments rained onto decks where crew fought fires, pulled the wounded, and steadied each other with brief words nearby. Witnesses later recalled the sound, an enormous crack that felt like a door blown open between two worlds, followed by heat and rushing air everywhere. Some remembered letters from home drifting from destroyed lockers and scattering on damp planks as smoke pushed low along the water and caught under boots. They remembered hands that shook and voices that steadied, and the taste of oil on lips, and the way time stretched strangely for everyone nearby. They remembered chaplains moving through smoke and fire, marking locations for teams, writing names, and offering simple prayers at the railings amid sparks and shouting. They remembered small bravery, a shared canteen, a jacket thrown across a friend, and the quiet afterward when ears rang without end in many memories. On the Nevada, steam built and tugs moved clear as her crew decided to try for open water rather than remain a fixed target there. She slipped down the channel under fire, drawing cheers from decks and shoreline, then met concentrated attacks that forced grounding to keep the passage open. The sight mattered, because movement under fire signaled resolve, and crews across the harbor felt purpose settle into muscle and breath during that first hour. On the Pennsylvania and dry dock, Anti-aircraft guns joined the fight, while destroyers nearby took strikes that set more fires and added wounded and missing harbor tugs worked without pause, pushing, pulling, and hosing decks, while small boats ferried stretchers toward piers where lines of volunteers formed quickly to help inside compartments on the Oklahoma. Trapped sailors tapped on bulkheads and counted breaths, while cutting teams assembled plans, torches, and prayerful patience by shared rhythm. Rescuers listened, chalked marks to track sounds, and worked methodically to open seams without flooding pockets that held frightened men alive through that long day. On other hulls, damage control parties shored bulkheads with timber, rigged pumps, and crawled through smoke to trace leaks and shut valves to slow flooding. Sailors passed buckets, axes, and hose lengths, and chiefs moved with practiced calm, setting priorities and matching people with tasks that fit the moment's need. The smell of oil, steam, and scorched paint mixed with seawater and grit, and boots slipped on ladders blackened by smoke during the hardest hours. Nearby neighborhoods felt the shock as windows rattled and sirens rose, and people saw flames surpass anything they had imagined in training or past drills. They gathered at shelters, gave blood, and cooked food for crews who would not leave their posts until long after nightfall on that December Sunday. Hospital corridors filled with stretchers, bandages, and the soft shuffle of shoes as lists formed to keep families informed with care as minutes turned heavy. Chaplains crossed between wards and piers, keeping names straight, speaking gently, and reminding the exhausted to drink water and breathe slowly before moving on again. On the water, smoke mixed with sea breeze and carried the smell of burning fuel into kitchens, churches, and small yards with laundry lines nearby. Pearl Harbor remained the center of the day's crisis, and Battleship Row drew attention because steel, fire, and courage met there at scale that morning. Teams fought to keep water ahead of flames, to vent compartments, and to bring ammunition up without risking fresh detonations as decks shifted and groaned. Signals officers used flags, lamps, and runners when wires failed, while petty officers kept order with clipped words and steady gestures that encouraged everyone nearby. Divers began probing wrecks almost immediately, feeling for breaks, ladders, and doors, and guiding survivors from pockets of air toward waiting boats. As daylight persisted, salvage officers started notebooks that would grow into months of plans, schedules, and hard choices about what could be raised and repaired and what memorialized. Through the afternoon, crews on the Arizona's Neighbors fought fires that reached across decks and down ladders, working from bow to stern relentlessly in the teams. Foam lines arced while hose streams hissed, and sailors used sand and blankets where water alone could not smother flame under constant sparks and noise. Medical stations grew wherever shade and tables could be found, with morphine, iodine, and careful triage guiding every motion of hands and measured spoken reassurance. Clerks wrote lists and times so that families could learn what happened, and so later decisions would have a clear record for every name possible. Across Battleship Row, leadership emerged at every level, from chiefs to new seamen, as people matched courage to specific, necessary tasks that filled every minute. Pearl Harbor also carried silence within the noise, moments when a voice fell and a decision landed, and 2 or 3 people moved together instinctively, A hand on a shoulder, a nod toward a ladder, a short sentence, and then action that made the difference between fear and focus there. Small choices multiplied into lives carried, compartments held, or fires caught before they spread. And those choices traveled down ladders like current through the ship. On the Arizona, many stories ended in that first blast. Yet the actions around her shaped the afternoon for neighboring crews who kept fighting steadily. They carried hoses past heat, checked lines with gloved hands, and kept watch for renewed attacks that might come with the next hour of strain. As smoke rose, photographers and artists recorded scenes for reports and for history, careful not to disclose positions or procedures that might harm defense efforts. Writers gathered names and facts, and they tried to place them in context without adding rumor or confusion to an already painful landscape for families. Leaders spoke briefly, promised a full response, and asked civilians to follow instructions about roads, lights, and the use of telephones during emergencies that night. In ships still afloat, cooks turned galleys into aid stations, brewed coffee for responders, and kept a steady stream of hot food moving to shore. That care mattered because exhausted people make mistakes, and every bit of warmth protected judgment as the shoreline worked through the longest afternoon in Meme. Ori, Pearl Harbor brought the country swiftly to a war footing. Yet on that day the focus was simple, immediate, and human. On every pier there, names were written. Bodies were carried with quiet respect, and personal effects were collected with notes to guide their return to families when possible. Later, neighboring ships sent men and gear to the Arizona's berth, and officers coordinated movements so efforts did not cross and create new hazards for responders. Some people kept diaries that evening and tried to set down events so the day would not blur in the weeks that followed for them. Those lines often mention the Arizona, the heat, the thud of secondary blasts, the color of the smoke, and the steady patience of helpers nearby. As daylight thinned, the last major fires along Battleship Row bent under constant streams, and commanders shifted attention toward guarding the harbor through the night teams secured ammunition, checked lines, and prepared watch rotations that balanced experience, fatigue, and the possibility of more alarms before dawn across ships and piers. Divers marked safe paths and returned with reports that shaped the next day's salvage plans and the assignment of scarce equipment to priority locations. First, on the Arizona's wreck, the glow lowered to embers while watchmen kept respectful distance and listened to the water lap against twisted steel. Through midnight, families across the island tried to sleep and found themselves listening for engines, sirens, and footsteps, and many kept lamps lit. Until morning returned again, Pearl Harbor would shift from emergency to assessment as leaders surveyed losses, honored the fallen, and began the work of deciding what could rise again. Lists would be refined, stories gathered, and medals recommended, while planners matched shipyard capacity to the needs of a Pacific suddenly at war with resolve. Engineers would study heat, blast, and flooding patterns, so that future designs, drills, and storage might blunt similar blows in the years ahead for sailors. The Arizona would become a place of mourning and teaching, a reminder of costs, courage, and responsibility, carried by those who serve and remember together. The phase that began beside Ford Island ended as the island steadied, and the nation gathered itself for decisions that would carry into years ahead. In the hours around Pearl Harbor, the island airfields, hospitals, and ordinary streets formed another front of the day. At Hickam and Wheeler, crews reached for helmets and hoses, while smoke rolled across hangars and runways. At Kaneohe and Iwa, mechanics dragged aircraft toward cover and pilots searched for any machine that could climb. Families living near the fences watched the sky change and felt a hard wind move through kitchen doors. Doctors across town lifted kits and started toward the base and toward clinics that would soon overflow. Pearl Harbor pulled attention, yet the first wave also aimed to blind the island by breaking the aerial shield. On the fields, aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip because leaders feared sabotage more than a sudden attack from the air crews rolled bombs from wrecks and tried to spread planes as alarms rose from guard shacks and towers. Some engines coughed to life while mechanics stood in open ground and waved brave signals through smoke. Others stayed cold, and crews shifted to buckets and stretchers with a speed learned in quiet practice. At Hickam Field, the first explosions cut lines of glass and threw doors inward across offices. Airmen ran to dispersal points and found them already under fire from strafing passes that stitched the ground aircraft that could move rolled toward open strips, while others became parts cannibalized in seconds to help a single flight. Bunkers built for supplies turned into aid stations, and crews taped signs with arrows that pointed toward triage tables. The smell of avgas mixed with burned rubber and hot metal and settled over the field like a heavy cloth. Wheeler Field lost hangars in minutes, and smoke climbed straight up as if pinned to the morning sky. Ground crews pulled ammunition on handcarts and found that belts ran out faster than any schedule they knew. Some fighters got into the air and drew fire away from runways where medics worked without pause. A few pilots walked from wrecks and turned immediately to help with hoses and litters and quiet orders. Neighbors arrived with wet cloths for faces and made room in cars for the wounded who needed quick rides to town. At Kaneohe Bay, sailors and Marines tried to launch patrol planes while bombs walked along the water. Workshops burned and men pushed crates into fire breaks and shouted for axes and bars to pry open jammed doors. The first wounded reached small clinics where pharmacists became surgical assistants and clerks held dressings with shaking hands. Lines formed outside with volunteers who brought water and sheets and tracked who had come and where they would go next. Chaplains and medics wrote names on scrap paper and pinned them to shirts so families could be told later with care. Pearl Harbor pushed Honolulu hospitals into a surge that no drill had fully tested at Queens. Corridors filled as stretchers arrived by truck and car and by Navy launch. Doctors triaged by breath, by bleeding, and by the chance to save a limb or a life. Nurses placed hands on shoulders and spoke in calm phrases that steadied people enough to hold still. Pharmacists mixed morphine and iodine, while volunteers boiled instruments and brought ice and towels and hot coffee. Ambulance drivers learned new routes as traffic control shifted to police and wardens who stood at corners with flags. Pearl Harbor meant bridges and key roads had to stay open for supply and for the wounded. Block leaders marked neighborhoods and shared lists, so searches could be focused if names did not appear at clinics. Radio stations read short bulletins and asked callers to keep lines clear unless they had urgent news. In living rooms, people folded towels, boiled water, packed sandwiches, and waited for the next request for help. The base hospital near Pearl Harbor had planned for accidents and drills, and now grew into a city within the gates. Parking lots became wards and courtyards became recovery floors with cots aligned by need and by urgency. Clerks wrote tags for clothing and kept boxes of watches and letters and rings for later return. The Chaplain Corps helped with records and with families who arrived searching for a single name. Physicians moved between surgery and triage, and used brief notes to guide nurses as cases shifted by the hour. Civilians on Oahu faced the shock with steady work that grew out of small habits of neighborliness. Garages fixed ambulances and trucks for free. Grocers sent crates to canteens, and teachers managed childcare in gyms. Laundry owners ran extra loads for hospitals, and printers ran maps and signs for shelters and routes. Pearl Harbor turned every block into a linked chain, and the links held through the long day and night. Some people wept and then kept working because action gave shape to fear and time. By midday, the second wave found many guns ready, though much of the island still fought fires and shock. At Airfields, the fight blurred into rescue, as gunners and medics traded places when crews went down. Pilots who could fly climbed into skies that were broken and yet still open enough to find an enemy. Those who could not fly guarded fuel and ammo dumps and cleared runways of fragments and wheels. Over the island, the sound of engines mixed with sirens and with a new rhythm of orders that repeated until they stuck. Hospitals managed scarce supplies by sharing and by quick requests that police and wardens carried. Pearl Harbor brought strangers together at blood drives where people lined hallways in quiet patience. Cooks sent soup and bread, and nurses urged everyone to drink water and to rest when told. Clerks logged donations and checked names against requests, so rare types reached the right rooms. First citizens who had never met shared benches and stories, and sometimes a hymn that calmed a waiting room. Police handled rumors carefully and reminded residents that lights had to stay off after sunset. Wardens prepared blackout curtains and tested signals that would guide people to shelters if planes returned. Pearl Harbor had shown that a city could be struck, and the night would be guarded with discipline. Fire crews rotated and saved strength as they kept watch over embers that still hid pockets of heat. The public learned a new language that day with words like warden and blackout, and curfew entering every home. In homes across the island, children asked direct questions, and adults answered plainly without detail that would wound. Teachers later gathered classes and explained safety steps and the meaning of the sirens that had sounded. Pastors visited the injured and spoke to families who waited for news that might arrive by note or by a knock on the door. Pearl Harbor reached into quiet streets and made neighbors into witnesses and helpers and sometimes messengers. Laundry lines emptied and living rooms became dorms and kitchens became canteens as the day continued. At the edges of the island, small boats searched for survivors while shoreline families pointed out slicks and debris. Fishermen knew currents and helped guide patrols and gave spare fuel and nets to the crews. Pearl Harbor had thrown oil upon the water, and that stain traveled with tide and wind. Volunteers wore cloth masks and worked beside sailors who were black with soot and salt. They carried ropes and ladders and blankets, and they kept their voices low to match the need for care. Toward evening, hospital staff prepared for the long night and tried to set a rhythm that could last. Pearl Harbor had already filled every ward, and yet more arrived until cots touched wall to wall. Surgeons closed cases by lantern when lights flickered and then moved to the next with steady hands. Nurses hummed so that needles did not shake, and orderlies learned to read eyes that could not speak. Families nearby sent pots of rice and stew and fruit and wrote notes to place on trays. In precinct houses and schools, leaders met to assign watches for rooftops and reservoirs and for bridges. They knew Pearl Harbor had turned the island into a target, and they would harden the map with people. Lists grew for food, fuel, medicine, and shelter, and each list found a steward who took pride in the role. Civic groups shaped lanes for supplies and shaped tasks for those who could not serve at sea or in the air. December 7th became an organizing memory before the sun even set, and the structure would hold in the weeks ahead. At air stations, the last aircraft that could fly were hidden to the leeward side of hills, and in any gap Pearl Harbor taught crews to park with space and to scatter fuel and parts in case flames returned. Guards checked papers and badges and learned faces as the day turned to a guarded and restless night. Mechanics pulled shards from tires and patched holes in skins and promised pilots that dawn would find them ready. Phones clicked as units coordinated patrols and kept language short and plain to avoid confusion in darkness. Night settled over the island as wardens checked streets and nurses dimmed lamps and pilots tried to sleep. Generators hummed and water pumps chuffed, and the island breathed in a slow and deliberate cadence. Families kept windows covered and listened for engines and for the short official messages that carried through the dark. Pearl Harbor had begun in morning light, yet its weight pressed deepest after midnight when footsteps slowed. On the airfields, embers hissed, tools cooled, and crews planned how to fly and how to fix at dawn. In the hospitals, names were spoken with care, and the living were steadied while the lost were honored. Civilians slept in shifts and kept coffee ready, and the island reached a wary balance as the wider war took shape. As Pearl Harbor burned in mid-morning, commanders across Oahu faced choices under pressure, radios failing, rumors rising. Signals moved unevenly through wires, and runners carried notes when switchboards jammed or sections lost power entirely. Leaders tried to separate fact from echo while finding the quickest way to steady frightened teams everywhere. Orders needed to be clear, short, and possible, or confusion would multiply across decks and streets nearby. In that first hour, courage appeared as quiet competence, and as decisions made without waiting for permission. Senior Naval Command gathered maps, assessed damage, and focused on air defense and the channel for movement. Army headquarters concentrated on skywatch, anti-aircraft guns, and protecting civilians in Honolulu and nearby communities today. Coordination improved as couriers linked staffs, though every message still competed with immediate fires and rescues ongoing. Chaplains and medical officers requested transport priority, and police cleared lanes so ambulances reached hospitals faster today. Supply chiefs opened warehouses, passed out masks and blankets, and logged each crate for later accountability reviews. Within operations rooms, clocks marked minutes that felt heavier than hours, while phones never stopped ringing anywhere. Watch officers weighed incomplete reports, trusted experienced chiefs, and issued directives that could be executed immediately everywhere. They prioritized defending fuel farms, repairing power lines, and keeping the entrance clear for essential movement tonight. Meteorology sections shared wind and cloud reports that could affect smoke, flight paths, and anti-aircraft effectiveness locally. Legal officers documented property use, requisitions, and civilian injuries, preparing records for families and future claims carefully. As reports stacked, leaders chose simple goals that everyone could understand and rally toward under strain together. Across communications nets, Pearl Harbor became shorthand for urgency, and distant stations offered help without prompting immediately. Coast artillery units realigned searchlights, checked ammunition, and rehearsed voice commands for blackout conditions after sunset. Statewide harbor pilots joined briefings that covered tides, wrecks, and hazards, then volunteered for dangerous guiding runs outward. Small acts of judgment kept stacking into momentum that made larger actions possible as afternoon unfolded steadily. Not every decision landed well, and some orders contradicted others before the picture cleared across commands entirely. Reports of subs near the entrance crossed with rumors, and patrol craft chased wakes that were harmless. A few batteries fired late or short, and adjustments followed as officers tightened rules for target identification. Confusion did not come from cowardice. It came from fatigue, noise, smoke, and the speed of surprise. Even amid uncertainty, Pearl Harbor drew out leaders who framed chaos into tasks that neighbors could complete. One petty officer took charge of a flooded space, organized teams, and kept breathing steady through darkness. Another young ensign rallied gunners, shifted positions, and learned to read bursts against the glinting sky quickly. A seasoned chief paired newcomers with veterans, and the pairs moved with quiet confidence into heavy smoke. Courage often meant speaking plainly, holding eye contact, and sending someone to rest before judgment slipped dangerously. Commanders learned to trust those voices, and they built a shared pace that prevented reckless sprints anywhere. Inter-service rivalry softened because necessity set the tone and made teamwork the only workable language that day. Army trucks hauled Navy hoses, Navy workshops repaired Army radios, and police escorted both without fuss anywhere. Civil authorities closed beaches, guarded reservoirs, and established curfews that balanced safety and necessary movement for everyone. The governor met commanders and spoke briefly, acknowledging Pearl Harbor and promising cooperation under a unified plan. Communications teams mapped alternate routes for messages and set schedules that shifted as parts were repaired successfully. Clerks kept situation boards updated, and they erased errors without pride, since accuracy mattered more than ego. A few headquarters rooms opened windows to vent smoke, and maps fluttered while staff continued their coordination. Water and coffee were issued as orders, and mess crews delivered trays like lifelines across corridors constantly. Inquiries from Washington began arriving, and summaries were drafted, cautious and factual, for transmission later that night. Leaders understood families needed names, yet they refused to rush where certainty had not formed just yet. Communication with outlying stations mattered, since an island chain cannot act safely without coordination across every channel. This network allowed fuel to move, planes to disperse, and medical teams to reach far communities inland. Forecast offices warned of shifting winds that could carry smoke toward treatment wards, prompting relocations where possible. Engineers examined bridges and docks, posted weight limits, and flagged spans for immediate reinforcement by available crews. Briefings began with the same sentence, that Pearl Harbor remained the priority while guarding the city perimeter. Secondary aims included search and rescue offshore and quick surveys of reservoirs, power stations, and roads island-wide. Command judgments gained strength as information improved and as emotional shock settled into focused resolve among crews. They named deputies for narrow tasks, a method that turned large problems into a set of lines. One deputy oversaw beach patrols, another managed salvage equipment, another handled hospital transport along specific routes inland. The approach created confidence because people knew who to call, and efforts stopped overlapping wastefully very quickly. By late morning, the first outlines of a sustained defense took shape in checklists and rosters everywhere. Air officers charted patrol arcs, paired aircraft and crews, and guarded scarce fuel for essential sorties. Only dockyard planners allocated cranes, divers, pumps, and welding teams, and fixed a rhythm for shifts that night. The raid had hurt the line of ships, yet salvage began while fires still hissed along decks. Command notes reminded everyone that accountability mattered, and that truth builds trust during recovery after sudden shock. There would be investigations later, but the present required steadiness, stamina, and attention to detail by all. Many acts of courage went unrecorded because the actors simply kept moving to the next task silently. A boatswain tied a line around his waist and pulled 3 swimmers clear through heavy oil slicks. A nurse managed an overflow ward with 15 volunteers, and every patient received water and comfort tonight. A driver memorized a detour map, then repeated the route until hospital stock rooms filled again before midnight. Through these efforts, Pearl Harbor shifted from shock toward organized response, even as losses mounted across commands. The timeline mattered, because rescue carried a short window, and fires could undo hard work very quickly. Command posts set alarms for revisiting tasks, which kept people from drifting when exhaustion set in. Later medical directors rotated surgeons, scheduled brief rest, and assigned scribes so records would stay precise under pressure. Harbor Defense crafted a plan to block channels if needed, while keeping paths open for rescue craft. Air units dispersed remaining aircraft, hid them near tree lines, and prepared decoy patterns for later days. Radio announcements adopted a steady cadence, repeated key instructions, and avoided rumor and speculation throughout the afternoon. The public learned to trust that voice, which brought order into homes and shops during uncertainty today. At midday briefings, Pearl Harbor framed each agenda, and priority lists were tacked to doors for clarity. Couriers sprinted between buildings with envelopes, then returned with receipts that confirmed delivery and action for commanders. Some headquarters moved to basements to reduce exposure, yet the mood remained focused and direct all day. Maps gained colored pins for fires, for medical sites, for patrol routes, and for repair priorities. Island-wide transportation officers commandeered buses, paired them with drivers, and created scheduled loops for evacuations and supply runs. Security teams posted guards at reservoirs and at telephone exchanges, since both were fragile targets that day. Comptrollers tracked spending in notebooks, because money trails would help later audits and compensation for affected families. Across the docks, Pearl Harbor crews stacked hoses, checked valves, and marked safe paths with chalk. Carefully signal flags reappeared on yards, a simple backup that worked when wires and radios faltered under strain. Ship captains reported status by launch, wrote updates, and handed copies to messengers for redundancy, and clarity crowds kept respectful distance at piers, understanding that every open lane could save a life that afternoon. Command took notice and thanked volunteers, which strengthened bonds that would carry through long months of war. Leadership also meant listening, since frontline voices often saw gaps before maps could reflect them in time. A mechanic noticed a weakness near a pump station, and engineers moved quickly to fortify it immediately. An orderly realized a triage area blocked a hallway, and the station shifted 10 yards within minutes. A pilot sketched an approach route on scrap paper, and controllers used it to vector patrols outward. These small collaborations became the backbone of resilience as Pearl Harbor fought through its longest day together. Decision-makers thought about the night ahead, when blackout rules would test nerves and patience across neighborhoods. They planned checkpoints with calm signage, and they trained wardens to speak firmly and kindly to everyone. They warned drivers to dim lights and slow, so convoys could pass without disorientation in thick smoke. They assigned roving teams to check reservoirs and hillsides for signals, and to calm fears at dusk. They asked churches and clubs to serve food, since shared meals help people endure difficult nights together. Throughout planning, Pearl Harbor stayed present in every sentence as a measure of what mattered that day. The names of ships informed priorities, yet the names of neighborhoods guided compassion and patience for families. Investigators began preliminary notes, careful to separate rumor from evidence, and to protect witnesses for future clarity. Leaders addressed prejudice directly, insisting that loyalty is proven by conduct and by service during shared danger. They instructed police to prevent harassment and to keep focus on safety and law across the island. They relied on community leaders to echo those words and to model calm for neighbors under stress. By evening watch, Pearl Harbor teams had built a scaffold strong enough to hold through darkness ahead. The scaffold included schedules, backups, and names, beside tasks that were simple and necessary for every shift. Courage still mattered, yet the best courage now flowed through structure, clarity, and patience, held by everyone night settled, and Pearl Harbor kept watch, while leaders prepared for long effort of repair and remembrance. As evening settled over Oahu on December 7th, Pearl Harbor still burned and the island steadied for a long night. Fires moved inside compartments and along shorelines, while hoses traced white arcs through smoke that hung over the water. Crews worked methodically, breaking heat with foam, knocking down sparks, and sealing doors to slow the spread. On piers, stretchers lined up beside coils and crates. Tugs shuffled between berths and carried teams, ladders, and pumps. The afternoon's noise faded into a heavy hum made of engines, voices, and wind. Pearl Harbor remained the center of gravity for every order and for every quiet act of help that crossed town. Hospital wards spilled onto porches and lawns, cots touched wall to wall, and tags carried names and times. Volunteers washed instruments, boiled sheets, and wrote lists that matched blood types to rooms. Clerks filed notes for families who would arrive tomorrow when roads opened wider. Along the channel, guards posted at fuel tanks checked valves, sanded slick spots, and kept buckets, shovels, and lights ready. The tank farms mattered because without them ships could not move, and planes could not fly. Marines rotated posts and learned the paths by heart. Engineers surveyed piers and bridges and set limits for trucks. The work was plain and repeated, and that repetition kept fear in check. Across Honolulu, wardens gathered whistles, armbands, and maps, and trained neighbors on how to dim windows and shield porch lamps. Blackout rules were simple and strict. Streetcars slowed and drivers taped headlights so a thin slit faced the road. Patrols walked blocks in pairs, watched the hills, and reminded shopkeepers to put out cigarettes near doorways. The city learned a new rhythm that valued quiet steps and careful light. Pearl Harbor sent a constant stream of the injured toward town, and the roads filled with marked trucks, ambulances, and private cars. Police cleared lanes with gestures and with firm, kind words. People pulled aside and waited on shoulders until convoys passed. Some drivers joined the loop, dropping supplies and returning for more. In that movement, the island found balance between urgency and order. On the waterfront, families searched for news, and sailors told them what they could without risking confusion. Names were handled with care. Chaplains stood near gates and kept lists. Telegraph offices stayed open and promised to send messages when lines cleared. Friends gathered in kitchens and shared coffee and rice and bread. The talk was soft and direct, and it left room for silence. Out at sea, pickets formed a rough net with eyes on the horizon, and with ears tuned to the low thrum beneath the waves, depth charges shook the water in short patterns designed to test any intruder. Spotters scanned each whitecap. Sailors strapped on life jackets and tightened helmets and settled in for a long watch. Pearl Harbor had pulled them outward, and the ocean felt both vast and near. Inside command posts, the tempo slowed a shade, and people began to breathe in counts. Boards on the walls showed fires contained, ships secured, patrols assigned, and supplies moving. Scribes recorded every change. The color of chalk meant status. Maps grew pins and short notes. Radios returned to steadier signals as repairs took hold. Pearl Harbor still framed every decision, yet the tone shifted from shock toward sustained work. At the airfields, ground crews salvaged what they could and built decoys from canvas, crates, and spare parts. Wheels were swapped and wings patched. Fuel was rationed so patrol flights could launch at dawn. Sentries paced the perimeters. Mechanics taught younger hands by lamplight and turned experience into checklists. The lesson of the morning was simple. Distance was not protection. Preparation had to live in every hour. Pearl Harbor also meant a long reckoning with names, and musters went on by flashlight and by patient voice. Survivors answered and then sat down to wait for friends who did not appear. Chiefs walked the rows and touched shoulders. Officers crouched and spoke softly. When a name was spoken without reply, a clerk drew a small line and left space for later. The notes would guide letters and visits. In houses near the base, neighbors laid quilts on floors and made room for families who had lost windows or doors. Children shared pillows and learned a new quiet shaped by sirens and orders. A few families kept chickens and sent eggs to canteens. Others baked bread through the night. Someone tuned a piano in a church hall so nurses could hear a tune between shifts. Small comforts steadied hands. The public voice on the radio kept sentences short and repeated essential guidance. People were told to conserve water, to report only clear facts, and to expect sirens again. Stations paused music so messages would land. Later, the music returned in low volume and gave rooms a calmer frame. The harbor sounded different through that speaker. It carried not only news, but a steady tone that people learned to trust. Near the piers, salvage officers began to sort cranes, divers, hoses, and patching plates, and to plan a schedule that could start at first light. Divers tested lines and marked safe paths with chalk. Boats ferried tools from shops. Welders checked rods and set aside spare masks. The damaged ships looked immovable, yet the crews around them refused that picture Pearl Harbor would be a place of work as well as mourning. As midnight approached, the island grew very still. Wind shifted and the smell of oil drifted inland again. Dogs barked once and then settled. At a few batteries, gunners misread a shadow and fired, and officers stepped in quickly and reset guard rules. The December 7th attack made nerves raw, and it took practice to keep hands from racing ahead of thought training would deepen starting tomorrow. Pearl Harbor reshaped evenings at sea, and captains learned to trust simple plans that could be executed in low-light pickets reported position at set times. Escorts screened tighter. Crews worked in whispers when near the channel. One sailor noted in a small diary that the stars felt close. Another wrote that coffee tasted different after fire. The words were plain and honest, and they traveled home months later. Families felt the length of the night most sharply in the hours before dawn. Lamps were turned low and curtains were pinned. Someone always watched the road. A neighbor sat by the door in case a knock came. In those rooms, people prayed in quiet voices. They promised to help with whatever was asked. Pearl Harbor tied strangers together, and that bond became a net that held through grief. Back on the base, notebooks filled with inventories that would feed the coming repair effort. The notes were dull and precise. Bolt sizes, pump counts, fuel on hand, oxygen bottles. Every page signaled intent. In the morning, cranes would swing and divers would mark edges and routes. The harbor would see rivets, patches, pumps, and winches. The language of recovery would be written in iron and in patience. Leaders met in small groups and chose a few core messages they would repeat. They would speak about steadiness. They would speak about neighbors. They would not speculate. They would promise action. A short statement carried more than a long one. Pearl Harbor demanded clarity, and the public responded to that tone. The next day would bring speeches, orders, and schedules. Yet the heart of it would be service reporters crafted careful lines that avoided detail that could aid an enemy and still told the truth. Photographers framed smoke and light and left out positions. Editors agreed to wait on some facts until commanders cleared them. The public would learn what mattered without risking the next day's safety. Pearl Harbor taught that openness and caution could live together. Trust would be protected by accuracy and by restraint. In a few homes, letters were already being written because writing gave structure to fear. Parents told children to sleep and then sat at the kitchen table and began. They wrote to grandparents and to brothers overseas. They described the sound and the smoke and the calm work of nurses and drivers. They did not write names they did not know. Pearl Harbor would cross the ocean through those envelopes. On the water, a few lanterns moved where crews still searched for voices under steel. Divers tapped and listened. Lines moved slowly. Rope creaked against cleats. Generators throbbed. The scene was dim and careful. Everyone on the pier understood the stakes. Each minute counted. The harbor's darkness hid quiet acts of strength that would not be photographed or reported. Those acts still carry weight in the way people remember the night. Dawn approached very slowly for those who had not slept. Roosters called from backyards and answered each other across alleys. The first light gathered above the hills and brought outlines back to buildings and trees. Firefighters rinsed hands and faces. Nurses folded blankets and checked dressings. Mechanics wiped tools and drank the last of the night coffee. The harbor waited for daylight because daylight would reveal what could be saved. In that pale hour, sirens were tested and then silenced, and the radio repeated that people should stay off the roads until called. Crews made final rounds at the fuel farms. Patrols reported all clear at reservoirs and at bridges. Children stirred and asked simple questions that cut to the heart. Parents answered with care. The island moved from one terrible day into another, and the work would continue with steadier hands. The sun rose on broken masts, scorched roofs, and smoke that still traced the air. People stood in a long quiet, and then began again. Paths were cleared and water boiled. Gear was sorted. Shoulders lifted. Pearl Harbor ended belief in easy distance and began a season of patient work. In the days after Pearl Harbor, strategy across the Pacific began to take shape in hurried rooms and at long tables. Washington weighed crises that were no longer distant or abstract. Honolulu rebuilt its network and sent steady updates that made choices clearer each hour. Tokyo read signals of surprise and success and looked toward a shrinking window before American strength recovered. London watched the map tighten around colonies and sea lanes. The Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and Guam all demanded attention at once. Decisions would link oceans, factories, and families. Plans had to travel by cable and convoy. The people who wrote them knew the cost would be measured in years. The first step was to set priorities that matched danger with what could be done. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese forces moved on lines drawn well before the morning of attack. Troops landed in Malaya and pushed toward Singapore as airfields fell one by one. Columns turned on Hong Kong, while shells reached the water along the colony's rim. In the Philippines, bases came under repeated strikes that split aircraft on the ground, and in the air, Wake and Guam faced landings that tested small garrisons. Commanders on both sides wrote notes that tracked fuel and shells by the hour. Pearl Harbor had removed a shield for a time, and that time was spent quickly. The goal from Tokyo was to lock a defensive ring that stretched across islands rich in resources. That ring would buy months for consolidation, while negotiation or fatigue might weaken Allied resolve. In Washington, the nation moved with clarity. Congress declared war on Japan after a short and solemn debate. Factories and bases shifted from peacetime rhythms to a mobilization that would touch every town. Admirals and generals reviewed commands in Hawaii and the West Coast. Changes followed as investigators gathered facts and leaders chose new hands to carry the burden. Pearl Harbor made speed a virtue and made clarity a shield. The Pacific Fleet needed a center that could plan across months while fighting through days. Carriers became the core of that center because they could strike and fade. Submarines received new orders to disrupt the long supply routes that fed distant armies. Every service learned that time at anchor had become the most dangerous time of all. In the Philippines, commanders faced a wrenching choice. War plans had imagined a fallback to Bataan, and to the forts at the entrance to the bay forward defense offered pride and risk. Yet the clock favored endurance over a quick stand. Supplies were finite and roads were narrow. Air cover thinned as fields were struck. Pearl Harbor echoed in each calculation because resupply across the ocean would take months. The decision was to trade ground for time and to gather troops behind natural lines. Civilians carried water and food to columns that passed through towns and farms. The hope was to hold long enough for relief to appear beyond the horizon. The reality was that relief would come later than anyone wished or said. Allied leaders stitched together commands across Southeast Asia and the seas north of Australia. A joint effort took form, known by initials that blended nations and services. Ships and aircraft gathered at Dutch and British ports. Airfields lengthened on the north coast of Australia. Troops from many flags stood guard along roads that led to ports and to inland towns. Pearl Harbor had turned Australia into a main rear base for the Pacific fight. Decisions in Canberra, Wellington, London, and Washington now shared a single calendar. Convoys began to thread the Indian Ocean and the Coral Sea. The goal was to hold a line that kept routes to the United States and to the Pacific Islands intact. That line would become the backbone of later offensives. American carriers started to probe. Raids struck the Marshalls and the Gilberts and reminded Allies that the fleet still had reach. Pilots learned to launch in harsh weather and to return in fading light. Commanders read fuel tables and mapped risk against gain. Pearl Harbor had shown that fixed positions invited danger. Moving groups, even if small, could force an enemy to react. Scouts and codebreakers began to feed the planning rooms. Reports hinted that a thrust toward Port Moresby was likely. The response was to gather a task force that could contest the approach and protect Australia. That choice led toward the battle that introduced a new form of sea fight without ships in sight. Another decision reached beyond immediate military effect. A daring raid would send medium bombers from a carrier to strike Japan's capital. The risks were obvious. The distance was long and the return uncertain. Yet the message mattered. Pearl Harbor had cut deep into public confidence, and leaders knew that a bold stroke could reset morale. Crews trained in short takeoffs and packed light. The launch came from gray water under heavy sky. Bombs fell on factories and docks. The raid forced Japan to pull units back and to consider new layers of defense. It also told Americans that action could reach across the ocean even in a hard spring. Events in Europe tied directly into Pacific choices. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The alliance became one war with many fronts. Leaders met in Washington with British counterparts and set a broad approach that favored Europe for final victory. Even so, the first months demanded heavy effort in the Pacific to hold ground and to keep allies safe. Pearl Harbor had opened the war for America, yet shipping, fuel, and aircraft had to be priced against a global list. The compromise was to sustain the Pacific while laying foundations for a larger push across the Atlantic. That balance took constant revision as losses, weather, and intelligence reports changed the board. In Tokyo, debate grew over how far to press the perimeter. Some urged a quick wheel to the south to sever Australia from the United States. Others argued for a blow that would draw out the remaining American carriers and end the threat in a single day. The case for a strike at a central atoll gained favor. Reconnaissance suggested that a victory there could force capitulation across the theater. Pearl Harbor had been a first move. The next would aim to end the opponent's freedom to move at sea. That decision set a clock in motion that would reach a turning point early the next summer. American analysts listened and read. Pieces of enemy codes gave partial pictures. Stations in Hawaii and on the West Coast compared notes, filled gaps with patient inference, and warned commanders when a faint pattern grew clearer. Pearl Harbor had taught the cost of assuming that time would warn before danger arrived. Now patience worked with urgency. Signals mixed with scout reports, with tide tables, and with weather forecasts. The idea was not to be perfect. The idea was to be ready at the right place, even if knowledge was incomplete. That approach guided the stand in the Coral Sea and prepared the frame for the larger contest that would soon follow. Another line of effort moved without photographs or headlines. Submarines sailed to cut the long flow of fuel, rubber, and ore that fed the new perimeter. Crews went to sea with orders that allowed quick action. Results came slowly at first, hindered by faulty warheads and fuses that did not behave as they should. Lessons were written in patrol logs and brought back to yards for fixes. Pearl Harbor had forced innovation. The quiet war beneath the waves would grow into a decisive pressure against shipping. Charts later would show the trade routes contracting and the factories short of parts. The choice to fight under the surface shaped the length and the end of the struggle. Strategy depended on logistics more than on any single plan. Shipyards extended shifts and laid new keels. Airframe plants added lines and trained crews who had never set a rivet before. That winter railroads scheduled troop trains and heavy cargo. The War Production Board began to steer materials into the channels that mattered most. Pearl Harbor turned schedules into promises that could not slip. Training centers opened classes for pilots, machinists, medics, and radio men. New construction units learned to build airstrips in heat and rain. Engineers plotted routes for pipelines and depots. The aim was simple. The Pacific is distance and time. Logistics had to shorten both until strategy could breathe. Command lines also changed. The Pacific was divided into broad areas that matched geography and the limits of communication. One command focused on the ocean and the central chains. Another centered on the Southwest Arc that shielded Australia and New Guinea. Pearl Harbor shaped those lines because it revealed where shocks could land and where counterstrokes could form. The arrangement let carriers and Marines move one way, while armies and air forces built pressure from another. Coordination grew through regular cables and through officers who had trained together years before. The aim was to keep the enemy guessing while building strength for an advance that could cross each island in turn. Alongside planning, leaders faced the work of explaining choices to the public. Messages stayed honest and concise. They told people what to expect and what to do. They did not promise quick endings. Pearl Harbor remained a point of reference, a reminder of why blackouts mattered and why rationing would appear. Farmers, machinists, and clerks wanted to help. Guidance turned that wish into action that counted. Bonds would fund ships. Scrap drives would feed mills. Schedules would place workers where they were needed most. Across the Pacific and across the continent, a resolve settled. Strategy found meaning only when supported by labor. The day's decisions reached every kitchen and every shop and prepared ground for sustained mobilization. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, American life shifted from caution to commitment. Families listened to steady voices on the radio and learned new words for daily use: ration, coupon, blackout, warden. Town halls filled as notices went up on doors. People asked what they could do, and work began immediately across the country. Together, factories retooled under federal direction while foremen studied new schedules and quotas. The War Production Board matched steel and rubber to contracts that grew weekly. The Office of Price Administration kept charts to steady markets and fight inflation. After Pearl Harbor, deadlines felt like duty. Night shifts lit skylines and whistles set the pace everywhere. Women stepped into lines at aircraft plants and shipyards, sleeves rolled and hair tied. Supervisors taught drilling, riveting, welding, inspection, and safety with patience and pride. Daycare opened in church basements. Cafeterias stretched hours to match transit. After December 7th, tools changed hands, and the work changed how neighbors saw one another closely. Daily. Bond drives turned squares into stages where bands played and speakers kept promises short. Posters asked for thrift, and families saved stamps in drawers. New withholding rules drew tax from paychecks to fund ships and planes. After Pearl Harbor, personal budgets tied to national plans, the connection felt direct, and it endured. Across hard months, ration books arrived by block and by schoolroom. Neat stacks with instructions. Sugar fell first, then coffee, gasoline, and tires, then meats and canned goods. Clerks stamped coupons and smiled at children who held the books like badges. After Pearl Harbor, markets moved onto a plan. The plan taught fairness and patience in every town. Vacant lots became gardens, and neighbors shared seeds and tools along fences. Guides explained rows, compost, pests, and water in clear language. Children counted tomatoes and peas and felt part of the war effort without leaving home. Since December 7th, soil and kitchens mattered. Harvest days brought pride, and meals stretched further through lean seasons. Civil defense offices trained wardens to guide blackouts, mark shelters, and report damage. Sirens were tested at odd hours, so people would learn to listen without panic. Schools held drills that moved children calmly to halls and basements. After December 7th, paperwork carried urgency. Clipboards and whistles became small anchors of reassurance. On long nights, stages rose in hangars and canteens where bands played for crews and nurses. The USO opened doors and kept coffee ready through rain and heat. Entertainers crossed coasts by train and bus and sang songs. After Pearl Harbor, the cut felt deep, and music helped close the first wound. Laughter returned carefully. In shared rooms, millions moved toward factories and yards, carrying suitcases and hope and letters of introduction. Neighborhoods formed near rivers and piers where blocks had been fields months earlier. Schools added trailers and churches opened basements for classes. After December 7th, movement that had already begun accelerated. City maps redrew themselves to fit production, block by block. Housing lagged behind hiring, and families doubled up or took rooms in converted parlors. Shipyard buses ran late and early so shifts could stack without congestion. Carpools became standard, and riders traded recipes and news. After December 7th, choices carried memory. Work ended tired people. Yet purpose made days feel bearable and clear. For months, universities turned labs toward radar, medicine, metallurgy, and the problems of distance. Professors taught day and night while students drilled, calculated, and shipped out. Partnerships joined colleges with industry and the services. After Pearl Harbor, ideas moved into hardware quickly. Breakthroughs reached docks and cockpits and wards where lives could be saved that week. Often, the Office of War Information shaped messages that balanced openness with care. Newsreels showed training, launches, and clinics, while avoiding details that might reveal locations. Newspapers printed maps that taught geography to readers who had never seen the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, the tone stayed sober. The public understood because families served everywhere in uniform. Mail became a lifeline, and V-mail condensed pages into film that traveled fast. Censors checked lines for risks and returned pages with neat marks and apologies. Sweethearts kept rituals that made distance bearable through hard seasons. Parents sent clippings and cookies. After Pearl Harbor, the letters carried comfort, humor, duty, and steady hope most nights. Training camps filled with recruits who learned to march, climb, navigate, and clean rifles. Chaplains counseled newcomers while medics checked vaccines and dentists filled long lists of needs. The mess line became a classroom in patience. The barracks became a school in friendship. After December 7th, they answered quietly and without display, with steady steps. Windows filled with small flags that carried blue stars for loved ones in uniform. Later, some turned gold, and the block grew quiet for a time. Neighbors left covered dishes and handshakes without speeches. Clergy stood on porches and stayed as long as needed. After December 7th, the door to sacrifice stood open for many. Black workers entered yards and plants in rising numbers and met both chances and barriers. Leaders in churches and newspapers argued for victory abroad and at home. The Double V campaign summed the mood with plain words and firm courtesy. Unions adjusted rules and training seats widened firmly. After December 7th, promises met practice. Everywhere, rural communities sent sons to distant seas and daughters to new mills and depots. Native nations answered with high enlistment and with specialized skills that would weigh heavily. Code talkers trained in secrecy and carried radios across islands months later after December 7th. Reservations linked to shipyards and bases. The ties traveled both directions, meaningfully. Movies offered newsreels, comedies, and dramas that gave rest on heavy weeks. Cartoon shorts joked about scrap drives and stamps and helped children feel part of the effort. Songs on jukeboxes carried longing. Pluck books on shelves shifted toward history and travel. After December 7th, taste grew practical without losing the wish for joy. Shortages changed routines in ways that became stories. Families still tell tires wore thin and speed limits dropped to save rubber, fuel. People learned patch and solder and barter. Shoes were repaired again and again. After Pearl Harbor, careful use and careful care became habits. The new habits stayed long after victory banners came down. Stress carried its cost, and doctors noted sleeplessness, headaches, and grief. Communities answered with routines that soothed. Choirs met even when blackouts dimmed lights. Ball fields hosted games on Sundays after shifts. Pastors and teachers listened. After December 7th, minds felt the weight. Yet rest could be found in small circles with familiar faces nearby. The War Manpower Commission matched hands to jobs and kept regions from stripping each other. Selective service sorted reports and skills, so units formed with balance. Farm labor programs moved students and prisoners of war into fields when harvests peaked. After December 7th, planning became practical. Paperwork became a bridge between town and front daily. Labor and management argued less in public and signed pledges that limited strikes. Disputes arose and boards heard cases quickly to protect production. Overtime was heavy and tempers sometimes frayed. Cafeterias and breaks were redesigned to ease strain. After December 7th, both sides stayed at the same table. Shared goals kept discussions civil most days. Congregations marked days of prayer and remembrance and welcomed strangers who needed calm. Synagogues, churches, and meeting houses kept doors open. Late charity drives filled barrels with sweaters, socks, and soap. Youth groups wrote to units overseas. After December 7th, many faiths stood in one posture. Service became the common language across neighborhoods. At scale, leagues debated whether games should continue while soldiers trained and ships sailed. Officials judged that recreation mattered. Games eased strain and supported drives. Players visited hospitals and posed for posters that urged bonds and stamps. Stadium lights dimmed when blackouts required it. After Pearl Harbor, schedules narrowed, yet there was room for joy. For many, schools shifted calendars to release students for harvests and civil defense duties. Science classes built radios, bandages, and planes. Mathematics classes learned navigation problems. English classes wrote letters for those far from home. After December 7th, classrooms reoriented toward service. Graduations still came with songs and photographs, though tassels carried a new weight for families. Railroads carried troops and freight by timetables that favored essentials first. Travelers postponed holidays, so flat cars and coaches could move supplies and units without delay. Posters asked whether a trip was necessary, and people agreed more often than not. After December 7th, patience became a national practice. Waiting became part of winning. For a while, coastal towns learned dime-out rules and painted tops of cars to reduce glare. Fishermen registered boats and followed patrol schedules that kept lanes orderly. Volunteers watched piers through fog and rain. Children learned to keep kites grounded near airfields. After December 7th, a careful courtesy took hold. Safety became a neighborly exchange. Most late evenings, chemists raced to produce synthetic rubber after plantations fell outside safe reach. Laboratories scaled pilot batches into rivers of material that kept trucks and tires turning. Communities gathered scrap metal, fats, paper, and rags. Collection days became block parties with work gloves. After December 7th, waste turned into value. Nothing useful was thrown away anymore. Leaders spoke on the radio and asked for endurance rather than applause. Fireside talks explained supply, risk, and the simple meaning of duty. Phrasing stayed humble. The effect was large. Since Pearl Harbor, the reference point for why rationing mattered and why mistakes would be corrected was clear. People felt included in decisions. Most days. By spring, the new routines felt familiar, though nobody mistook them for ease. Work filled weeks and letters filled evenings. Communities held together through patience and kindness. Since Pearl Harbor, distance had fallen away and shared resolve had taken its place. That resolve would be tested by fear and policy, and neighbors would face questions. In the months after Pearl Harbor, suspicion spread across the West Coast with a speed that surprised seasoned officials. Newspapers carried reports that mixed fact and fear. Rumors linked lights on hills to secret signals. Neighbors looked twice at store owners they had known for years. Leaders promised security and asked for patience while investigations continued. For families of Japanese ancestry, daily life shifted in days. Savings were counted, school books packed, and questions gathered without answers. Radios spoke of loyalty as if it could be measured by a glance. The nation began to balance danger and rights, and balance wavered. Before formal orders, federal agents arrested community leaders and closed some language schools and newspapers. Alien registration cards were checked more often. Curfews arrived in certain zones. Bank accounts were frozen during reviews. Families learned new rules in crowded meetings at churches and halls. On Oahu, martial law took hold. Yet mass removal did not occur because the economy needed workers and the community was woven into every trade. Some were detained as suspected risks after interviews and tips. Others were watched by neighbors and by long lenses. The line between caution and prejudice blurred, and it would blur further. Executive Order 9066 authorized military leaders to set exclusion zones and to remove civilians from those areas. General headquarters along the coast drew lines on maps that stretched from Washington to California and into Arizona. Notices appeared on telephone poles with dates and instructions. The War Relocation Authority was created to manage what followed. Families had days or weeks to prepare. Suitcases had to hold a life. Storage was uncertain and theft was common. Pets were left behind. Businesses were placed in trust or sold in haste. Pearl Harbor stood behind every word, and fear carried the final signature then. People were sent first to assembly centers at fairgrounds and racetracks. Barracks went up fast inside grandstands and under bleachers. Families slept in former horse stalls scrubbed with lye. Lime could not erase the smell lines formed for mess halls and clinics. A tag number followed each person from line to line. Children tried to make games from the waiting. Ministers, priests, and teachers arranged services and classes. Friends brought packages to gates. Photographers recorded faces behind wire. Pearl Harbor echoed in every guard post while communities sorted baggage and news. Summer heat turned boards into ovens across the yards. Trains carried families inland to 10 main camps surrounded by arid land or swamp Manzanar, and Tule Lake rose in California. Minidoka stood in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in Utah, Poston and Gila River in Arizona Granada, also called Amache in Colorado, Rower and Jerome in Arkansas. Each site had barbed wire and towers. Barracks were thin-walled with coal stoves, and dust found every seam. Latrines were shared. Showers were open. Medical staff arrived with limited supplies. Schools and councils began as soon as lumber could be spared. Pearl Harbor lay inside every timetable that shaped arrival. Daily life settled into routines that never felt normal. Families ate in mess halls rather than at home tables. Privacy thinned and discipline grew. Work crews built roads, dug ditches, stacked coal, and planted fields. Wages were small and carefully tiered. Doctors, teachers, cooks, and carpenters earned little yet kept the towns running. Clubs formed for sports, music, debate, and dance. Residents printed newspapers that balanced local news with updates from the front. Gardens softened corners. Artists recorded daily scenes with charcoal and camera. Pearl Harbor had pushed them here, and effort turned fear into structure that could hold firmly. Courts wrestled with the reach of wartime powers as curfew and exclusion were tested. In one case, a student challenged a nighttime order and lost, and justices deferred to commanders. In another, a young man who had remained with his family was convicted for failing to leave, and the conviction was upheld. A third case involved a woman who had been cleared as loyal, and the court ruled that she must be released. Pearl Harbor framed the arguments, and fear weighed heavily. The decisions mixed caution and deference. They left deep questions that later generations would revisit carefully in law. In 1943, officials issued a questionnaire that tried to separate allegiance and future service. 2 questions caused debate because their wording was vague and their stakes were real. One asked men about willingness to serve. Another asked all adults to swear unqualified loyalty and to forswear ties to an emperor many had never sworn to in the first place. Confusion deepened when citizenship and status collided. Families split on how to respond. Tule Lake became a segregation center for those who answered no or refused. Pearl Harbor sat within every form. The paper cut into community bonds and into sleep. Thousands volunteered for service while relatives remained behind fences. The 100th Infantry Battalion formed from Hawaii and trained on the mainland. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team followed and joined ferocious campaigns in Italy and France. The record of rescue and advance became part of national memory. Military intelligence units recruited bilingual soldiers who listened, translated, and persuaded in jungles and on islands. Pearl Harbor had made questions sharp, and service answered with action. Families hung stars in windows while letters described mud, laughter, and loss. The contrast between heroism abroad and confinement at home marked a wound that still speaks Hawaii, followed a different path shaped by geography and labor. Martial law placed the islands under strict rules that touched courts, business, and daily life. Yet wholesale removal never came. The economy depended on field hands, mechanics, and dock workers who were often of Japanese ancestry. Island society was interwoven in ways that made blanket suspicion unworkable. Some leaders and teachers were held far from home after individual reviews. Others reported to military offices and kept curfews. Pearl Harbor remained an open wound. Yet the approach stayed targeted. Even so, prejudice found outlets, and many lived with watchful eyes at night. On the mainland, removal shook agriculture and opened space that others filled. Crops withered when fields lost owners. Some neighbors kept farms alive for absent friends. Others bought equipment cheap. After months in camp, some left to resettle in cities like Chicago and Denver, where defense work needed hands. Churches and civic groups offered rooms and contacts. The War Relocation Authority issued passes and checked employers. Pearl Harbor still shadowed their arrival, and landlords sometimes said no. Veterans later returned to towns that had changed twice. Some found welcome. Some found broken windows. Many rebuilt carefully and kept going forward. Children carried the weight in ways adults noticed only years later. Schools formed inside barracks with chalkboards hung on string and books passed from hand to hand. Teachers built routines that honored study and play. Clubs met after class. Scouts learned first aid and knots. Doctors tracked outbreaks and malnutrition and fought dust and heat. Artists drew scenes that later entered museums and albums. Photographers documented faces with care. Censors reviewed images for security. Pearl Harbor appeared in essays as a date that split childhoods. The young grew older quickly and then grew gentle with their own children in time. Inside the camps, pressure produced protests that took many forms. At Poston, workers walked off jobs to demand fair wages and respect for councils. At Manzanar, a confrontation between residents and military police turned deadly and left deep scars. At Tule Lake, strikes and clashes reflected the burden of segregation and the grind of years. Leaders within the community tried to calm crowds and to pass grievances in writing. Administrators varied widely in patience and skill. Pearl Harbor colored every exchange, and suspicion returned quickly. The record shows both anger and restraint, and both are part of the history now. As the war turned, exclusion orders eased and closures began. Notices announced that people could leave if they had sponsors and jobs elsewhere. Some families tried new cities. Others returned to coastal towns. Doors did not always open. Arson and assaults occurred. Police sometimes protected and sometimes looked away. Courts processed claims for lost property slowly. Congress created a small program for partial compensation. Pearl Harbor had started the chain, and the end did not erase the years between churches, temples, and friends helped people find footing. The work of rebuilding began in earnest and would take patience and care. Decades passed before a national apology was made. Veterans raised the issue quietly. Students asked blunt questions. Lawyers and historians gathered records. The redress movement built chapters, hearings, and marches. A federal commission took testimony in cities across the country. and issued a report that called the policy unjust. The title was remembered widely, "Personal Justice Denied." Congress debated and passed a law that offered an apology and a payment to each surviving person who had been incarcerated. Pearl Harbor was acknowledged as the spark, not the excuse. Education programs grew so that future choices might be wiser for all. Today, the story rests in museums, classrooms, films, and family tables. Survivors speak and children listen. The sites remain open to visitors who walk quiet paths between foundations and wind. Pearl Harbor still anchors the timeline that led to removal and return, and it sits beside the memorials to sailors who never came home. The lesson is not abstract. Fear can race ahead of judgment. Rights need defenders in every season. Memory also needs care so names are not lost. This chapter closes with a promise to remember, and with a turn toward mourning held in places of water everywhere. After Pearl Harbor, the work of memory began even before the smoke thinned over the channel. Sailors marked places with chalk and families waited together. When bodies were carried from the water, chaplains spoke quietly, and doctors wrote names with care so every letter would reach the right home someday. The harbor shaped those first records and shaped the promise that remembrance would be plain, honest, and large enough to hold grief without spectacle forever. Salvage crews decided what could rise and what must remain, and the Arizona stayed where it lay. A ship-turned tomb under open sky, permanently oil seeped slowly from seams and spread thin rainbows, and islanders began calling the drops tears, a small moving memorial that never asked for words. For years the war filled headlines, and remembrance kept to kitchens, barracks, and church halls, where stories were traded without bitterness and without exaggeration. Often, after victory, families returned, met trains, planted trees, and learned again to live ordinary days. Yet the harbor remained a landmark within every quiet conversation. Pearl Harbor carried a second life in letters written by survivors who kept brief notes about friends, machines, weather, and the moments that still visited. At the shoreline, a flag flew from the Arizona's raised mast, and small groups came by boat to stand, to salute, and to listen there. Some brought flowers wrapped in paper, some brought notes, and some brought only silence, which carried more weight than any speech that might be given. As the territory became a state, leaders and veterans pressed for a memorial that would invite reflection without spectacle and would keep the site open. Pearl Harbor gave their case gravity, and newspapers across the mainland printed brief appeals that framed the project as a national duty shared by many. Private donations arrived in envelopes, and school children sent coins, and a concert by a famous singer drew headlines and pushed the fund across a threshold. An architect with a modern eye shaped a structure that rests above the wreck, with light wells, open sides, and a dip that suggests endurance. Inside, a corridor carries visitors toward a shrine room where a wall holds names cut into stone, simple letters that speak without raising their voice. Pearl Harbor stands visible through each open side, and the sea moves underfoot, and the ship remains present as a neighbor rather than a relic. Park rangers guide boats across the channel. Sailors keep watch, and the ride settles visitors into a quieter pace that prepares the mind for reading. In the theater near the pier, A film offers context and testimonies that set dates and places in order before anyone steps onto the water. Pearl Harbor fills that room with a quiet that is different from shock. A quiet shaped by patience, learning, and the simple wish to honor survivors' visit when health allows. And some choose interment within the ship, their ashes carried by divers to rest with shipmates in the darkness below. Bells ring for them. Rifles fire a salute at shore, and flags fold into triangles that families hold with care on the slow ride back. Across the memorial, drops still rise from seams and ribbon the water, and many visitors lean over the rail and watch until the circle widens. This harbor brings people from nations once at war, and wreaths are set together, and a bow acknowledges sorrow and the hard work of peace. Teachers speak softly on the boats, ask students to notice names, to find ages, and to think about families waiting at kitchen tables in winter. The harbor lives in their notebooks afterward, as sketches, lists, and reflections, and many write that the quiet felt heavier than photograph they had seen nearby. The Oklahoma has a memorial made of posts that mark births, a geometry that turns the list of names into presents for those lost. Atop the hill, the National Cemetery of the Pacific holds graves within a crater, and families walk terraces that look toward the sea and town. Pearl Harbor links these places, from the water to the hillside, and the route teaches that mourning can be both private and shared without conflict. Museums keep letters, uniforms, diaries, and photographs, and curators choose labels that explain without argument, so visitors can listen to the objects without distraction. Today, Pearl Harbor appears in films, songs, and novels, sometimes with precision, sometimes with errors, and the memorial helps correct memory by anchoring story to place. On each December 7th, a mourning ceremony begins at first light, and a bell marks the minute when the first bombs fell across the harbor. The harbor sits quiet during that moment, and the city pauses, and radio carries a voice asking for patience, kindness, and resolve through the year. The USS Missouri rests nearby, and visitors can stand on deck where surrender papers were signed. A view that frames beginning and end in harbor. Pearl Harbor feels larger under that gaze, because the space holds grief and relief, and the sea keeps the distance between them measured and calm. Rangers tell visitors that silence is a gift to strangers, and that the names on the wall once laughed at school and walked home barefoot. The site also asks adults to forgive themselves for not knowing detail, and to keep listening to those who remember while time reshapes the chorus. The design teaches without a sentence, since light falls through the open roof, and shadows move along the floor like a slow tide through daylight guides point toward Ford Island and Battleship Row. And they speak about each birth with restraint, keeping stories close to actions, names, and simple facts. Pearl Harbor sits within a wider constellation of memorials that study war and service, and visitors often leave thinking about the responsibilities that follow remembrance. In local homes, framed photos rest beside bowls for flowers, and families speak the date softly and cook a dish that a loved one favored. Sailors stationed nearby learn the route by heart, and many return on days off to stand a while and to practice the steady quiet kept there. Pearl Harbor remains a working base beyond the memorial. and the sound of drills and horns blends with the hush, reminding visitors that service continues. Some survivors from the attacking force have visited as elders, and they have bowed and placed flowers, and they have spoken gently with former enemies. The memorial allows that kind of meeting, since the site holds to humility, and the water cools the edges of words that might otherwise catch. Researchers study corrosion and currents to protect the wreck, and divers track changes in structure, and teams consider how to honor both artifact and see. Pearl Harbor taught engineers to think about preservation within water, and to plan for decades, and to balance safety, access, and dignity of those within. Around the visitor center, exhibits reach toward context, showing maps, letters, uniforms, and a single bell, so a person can connect facts to faces easily. Pearl Harbor is also a place of first learning, where children discover how a date can carry many stories and still hold a single meaning. Docents sometimes ask them to look at the faces around the boat, and to notice elders, uniforms, and language, because remembrance belongs to everyone present. This place also gives artists a frame, and painters return with quiet colors, and musicians write lines that float like oars moving across still water. Local crews maintain piers and engines, and they speak about work with pride, since getting people there safely is itself a form of honored service. The memorial stays open through rain and bright sun, and the tide line climbs and falls, while the names on the wall do not move. Visitors often leave notes at the shoreline, and wind can take them. So volunteers gather pages carefully and route them to archives for safekeeping later. This site has changed less than the city around it, and this contrast helps people see how memory fixes one landscape while another grows busier. The boats glide in loops, and the route turns, and each arrival feels like a breath drawn in before a room fills with listening again. The visit sends people back to their lives more careful with time, more patient with strangers, and willing to find steady words when sorrow visits. As years pass, survivor groups grow smaller, and younger guides carry stories for them, repeating cadence that respects detail, pauses, and the weight of names. The harbor keeps teaching through that rhythm, where stillness alternates with plain sentences, and where the water and wind handle the rest without instruction gently. Writers return in every decade, and they find new ways to describe the same place, since generations look with eyes yet feel the same pull. The harbor anchors their pages to a map that never moves, and helps them measure courage as action taken when help feels beyond the horizon. Researchers catalog artifacts recovered during salvage and training, and link them to letters, so peace tells where it came from and who once held it. The harbor sits inside those catalog numbers, and story reaches classrooms, where students can trace a life from a hinge to a name on stone. Volunteers help elders navigate ramps and steps, and they steer wheelchairs to the best sight lines, so nobody misses the wall or the slow oil circles. This harbor holds patience for each pace, since remembrance is not a race, and the meaning of the place arrives when it is ready anywhere. As evening comes, the boats complete last trips, and the flag lowers, and the harbor glows, and people carry the quiet back across the pier. Pearl Harbor leaves them with a sense of duty, and a belief that remembrance can guide change, which is where the country must continue walking. Pearl Harbor forced the United States to reconsider time, distance, and duty at once. In the shock and the smoke, leaders and neighbors learned that oceans could not shield a busy country. The lesson moved into plans, budgets, and habits that outlasted the war. Factories, shipyards, and schools became parts of one long chain. Families felt that chain touch kitchens and sidewalks. Commanders felt it shape choices at sea and in the air. The adjustment was not simply military. It reached law, policy, memory, and daily life. The country began to live with readiness as a quiet form of care. Carriers moved from experiment to centerpiece, and battleships ceded pride to decks that could range far and strike fast. Torpedoes, bombs, and fighters were joined by scouts that searched beyond the horizon. Training shifted toward coordinated groups that learned to turn, refuel, and fight as one moving field. Damage control became a craft that every sailor respected. Fire, flooding, and power loss were treated as problems that could be slowed and solved. The attack taught that survival rewarded flexibility, so design and practice turned toward resilience first in hard seas. Radar left the margins and entered daily operations with crews that knew its strengths and its blind spots. Interceptors learned to trust controllers and to meet unknown tracks with discipline. Code breakers expanded units that had been small before the war and built teams that mixed linguists, mathematicians, and sailors. Reports reached planners faster and with clearer caveats. The shock reminded staffs to share what mattered instead of guarding corners. Training favored simple language on crowded circuits. The result was missed hints and more mornings that began ready rather than surprised. Cities kept blackout plans, siren tests, and wardens long after victory, so people would remember how to act together. Factories ran drills that moved first aid, fire crews, and shelter teams into motion without fuss. Schools taught maps and plain steps for safety. Neighborhoods set radio habits that favored steady voices over rumor. Pearl Harbor had shown that clear instruction saves minutes, and minutes matter. Later generations folded these habits into new systems that watched coasts and skies. Readiness settled into routine without language and became part of civic life. Law adjusted in ways the country regretted and in ways that helped. Wartime authority grew to meet danger, and courts wrestled with where limits should stand. Pearl Harbor stood behind arguments for speed, and it also stood behind later calls for restraint. The nation learned to ask for evidence before it accepted claims about threats investigations. After the war helped build oversight that strengthened trust. Decades on, apology and redress acknowledged harms done to citizens who had been removed. Memory turned into policy that promised to guard rights in storms. Industry learned to scale quickly and to link research, factories, and depots with clocks that matched combat needs. Universities joined workshops and built a flow of ideas into tools that reached flight decks and field hospitals. Managers kept charts that showed where parts were and where they were late. Pearl Harbor sat behind the urgency, yet the methods stayed after victory. They shaped highways, ports, and distribution centers. They shaped how the country thought about training and safety. The habit of coordination carried forward into projects demanded patience and effort. Foreign policy shifted from seasonal engagement to a standing presence. Bases across the Pacific gained airstrips, docks, and schools that linked families to a wider map. Alliances deepened with neighbors who had fought beside American crews. Pearl Harbor remained the reason many leaders gave when they argued that distance should not guide policy. The choice to stay involved shaped decisions in Korea, in treaty networks, and in how aid moved after disasters. The country learned to read the Pacific as a concern rather than a far region visited in crisis. Veterans returned with skills, patience, and a sense that service could continue in quieter forms. The GI Bill opened classrooms and mortgages and widened the middle of the country. Hospitals grew into a system that learned to treat wounds seen and unseen. Towns built memorials and parks where neighbors gathered on quiet mornings. Pearl Harbor remained the first date in many speeches at those events. The link between sacrifice and shared investment felt clear. Highways, schools, and clinics carried that promise into travel, study, and care across cities and farms. Words changed. Remember Pearl Harbor became a vow, a banner, and a melody that people could hum without thinking. Politicians used the phrase to frame budgets and to ask for patience when plans were hard. Teachers used it to set context before lessons about the war. Families used it at tables when they told stories. Over time, the phrase asked for balance as well. It asked people to remember courage alongside caution and sorrow alongside strength. Memory widened to hold more than anger, and widening helped the country grow steadier. Designers changed ships in ways that surfaced from hard reports. Compartments gained stronger doors and better pumps. Magazines moved and were shielded with care. Fire mains were looped so a single hit would not silence a deck. Anti-aircraft guns multiplied and crews drilled until muscle acted before fear. Airfields placed planes farther apart and built revetments that broke blast and flame. Pearl Harbor lived in each blueprint and in each drill. The sum of changes made fleets and bases less brittle, and that resilience saved lives in later fights. Communities changed how they saw one another. On the islands, shared service and shared work during blackout and ration brought neighbors closer across language and tradition. The path toward statehood grew from that trust. On the mainland, years of suspicion gave way slowly to respect found in service records and in classrooms. The attack had revealed both fear and courage. Pearl Harbor remained the test when people argued about loyalty. Over time, the lesson won ground, that belonging is proven by conduct, and that rights protect everyone when stress rises. Families adjusted in ways that did not make news. A watch was kept in a drawer. A photograph moved from mantel to a wall near the door. Letters were tied with ribbon, and saved birthdays added an extra chair for a while. The habit of checking the sky stayed with people for years. Pearl Harbor became part of family language, shaped into lines that children could hold. Those lines carried pain and pride together. Later, the lines became stories, and the stories taught patience, kindness, and a respect for time. Classrooms built units that asked students to read names, trace maps, and listen to elders who could still visit. Museums gathered letters, tools, and uniforms and set them beside careful labels. Filmmakers and writers tried to show events without raising the volume. Pearl Harbor gave these efforts a center. The harbor allowed a walk from fact to empathy, which is the point of teaching history at human-paced lessons turned toward choices and toward the costs of delay. The hope was simple, that knowledge might keep alarms from being missed. Security institutions changed shape. Early warning stations spread along coasts and across inland peaks. Joint commands learned to share plans from the first hour of any crisis. Continuity offices kept binders that explained who would act if leaders could not be reached. Exercises moved beyond single bases and taught states to work with federal teams. Pearl Harbor remained the example for why speed and clarity mattered in the first minutes. The country did not choose fear. It chose practice. Practice built confidence, and confidence helped leaders avoid panic and delay. Remembrance kept shifting as new generations faced different kinds of danger. Firefighters, nurses, and pilots found meaning in the example of steady work under pressure. City planners found meaning in layered systems that do not fail all at once. Pearl Harbor helped people see that courage can be ordinary and collective. The story was not owned by one service or one town. It belonged to families, crews, and classrooms spread across the map. That breadth protected the memory from turning brittle. It stayed useful because it stayed close to choices. Pearl Harbor remains a mourning and a map. It points toward work that keeps faith with the people who faced fire and smoke. The changes that followed are still with us in drills, in designs, and in the way leaders speak when sirens sound. The story asks for steadiness rather than drama. It asks for clear words and neighborly hands. If we keep that posture, we honor the day in the way that matters most. Night falls, dawn returns, and the country keeps watch with patient eyes for many years.